So we have this website here we're looking at, and the following is an excerpt from the above website. Apparently they're saying King James only. Let's take a look at that. I just checked this website, and its conclusion is that the King James Version is not the inspired version. It's just an excellent copy by scribes from the original documents that they had, or the documents that they had in various languages, including the Vulgate, Textus Receptus, as well as some of the Greek, a number of Greek manuscripts, primarily the Byzantine. The text behind the King James Version, the Greek text used by the translators who made the King James Version, is commonly referred to as the received text, which in turn had its beginnings in the early 1500s, when the first Greek texts were made. The Complutensian Bible was a polyglot Bible, published in several volumes. The fifth volume, which included a Greek text of the New Testament, was printed in 1514. However, Erasmus's Greek text, printed in 1516, was the first to be marketed. For this reason and others, the text prepared by Erasmus surpassed the Complutensian text in popularity and exerted the greatest influence on all the texts to follow for the next few centuries. I studied a number of the versions in seminary, and it's an excellent, King James Version is an excellent version. A number of places here and there we have to question. That's why we view several versions. I review 7 versions, and when there's a discrepancy, I look it up in the original language as best we have, the manuscript evidence, and I use Comfort's book as well to give me an insight into which is the best rendering. And most of the time it's 99.5% reflective of the other versions around, like NASB, King James Version, and then the New King James Version, and the Authorized Version, the AV, let's just take a look, the Holman Standard, NIV, and so on. So I came away with confidence that I, not as a great scholar, devoted my life to doing all this kinds of specialized research, can determine what God's Word says for me. And then I go back and check against other resources. So, for this reason and others, the text prepared by Erasmus surpassed the Complutensian text in popularity. Is popularity going to get? No. And exerted the greatest influence on all the texts to follow for the next few centuries. But we didn't go too far afield. We didn't have blasphemous stuff in the King James Version. After Erasmus's text had seen several revisions, Robert Estienne, commonly referred to as Stephanus, published successive editions of a Greek text. His first 2 editions were compounds of Erasmus's text and the Complutensian text. However, the 3rd edition, 1550, was based primarily on the 4th and 5th editions of Erasmus's text. This 1550 edition gained wide acceptance in England, and for many is synonymous with the received text. However, it was not until 1624 that the phrase received text, or in the Latin, Textus Receptus, was actually coined. And then it was from the preface to the 3rd edition of a Greek text published by Bonaventure and Abraham Elzevir. The words were, as described by Bruce Metzger, part of a more or less causal phrase advertising the edition, what modern publishers might call a blurb, advertising scheme or something. The phrase boasted in Latin that the text presented was the text which is now received by all. Thus came the phrase Textus Receptus, or received text. The people who don't want to do their homework and get into it, they swear by this is the inspired Word of God, but what did all the other people do before that, and what did they do when King James English wasn't around? The text published by the Elzevir brothers was mainly taken from a text published by Theodore de Beza in 1565. Beza's text showed its heritage from that of Stephanus, and ultimately from that of Erasmus. It is this basic text, common to Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza, and the Elzevir brothers, which lies behind all the Protestant translations into English that were made from the Greek language prior to the 19th century, including the King James Version. So according to the new Schaff-Herzog Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge, the Textus Receptus resolves itself essentially into that of the last edition of Erasmus. As we stated before, no translation is due the reverence which many have toward the King James Version. Moreover, while the King James Version represents a scholarly translation from the Greek because of the Greek text which lies behind it, it is perhaps even somewhat less deserving of such high esteem than some other translations, especially the ones that come along later, which are taken into consideration manuscript discoveries by archaeologists, especially from the Alexandrian Egyptian area. Bruce Metzger writes, "So superstitious has been the reverence accorded the Textus Receptus that in some cases attempts to criticize or amend it have been regarded as akin to sacrilege. Yet its textual basis is essentially a handful of late and haphazardly collected minuscule manuscripts, and in a dozen passages its readings is supported by no known Greek witness." That's what I was telling you about the book of the Revelation and some of the epistles of John. They had nothing there in the Greek. So Erasmus was relegated to using the Vulgate Latin, which came from some other Greek text, but they didn't have the Greek text. The text of the New Testament, page 106. The vast majority of textual variations between the Textus Receptus and later texts, which are based to a large extent on older manuscripts, came before the ones that have been discovered later or made available only in the last 150 years, are of no significance whatsoever. Whatever. See, so it's a great translation. Just don't get off on a tangent about it. It's blasphemous because some modern translations, like the NASB, they use modern English expressions. They don't go back to Shakespeare and say, "What would you like to use for this?" At other times, the variants merely represent the attempt of some scribe to supplement one synopsis account with a detail legitimately provided in the account of another synoptist. They try to editorialize. However, occasionally the variations are more serious. That can be resolved because the Bible repeats itself over and over and over again. So you have a discrepancy. You go, well, it says it over here. It doesn't say it over there. Let's see. Although much credit is due to Erasmus for having made a Greek text available to all, the text which he presented was not of good quality. The half dozen manuscripts used by Erasmus were all of late origin. Most, if not all, were from the 15th century, while two may have been made as early as the 12th century. He had only one manuscript which contained the book of Revelation, and it was missing the final leaf which had contained the last 6 verses of Revelation. For these verses, Erasmus turned to the Vulgate, I told you, a Latin translation of the Scriptures. As a matter of fact, this article goes on to say, Erasmus translated the Latin back to Greek. How do you do that? Reverse engineering. Thus, for those verses, it was a contrived Greek text which eventually came to be translated into English in the King James Version. Trying to discover the original Greek text by looking at a Latin version is a little like trying to discover the exact ingredients used in making a German chocolate cake by tasting it. While your guess may be close, you will not be exactly right. Thus, some words which have never been found in any Greek manuscript were incorporated into Erasmus's text, and in turn into the Textus Receptus and the King James Version. For example, at Revelation 22:19, the phrase Book of Life in the King James Version should be Tree of Life. Big difference. Loss of salvation? No. Loss of rewards. See how that gets? According to all known Greek manuscripts. In other passages also, Erasmus took into his text words and phrases found in the Latin Vulgate, but supported by virtually no Greek manuscripts. Thus, in Acts 9:5-6, the King James Version inherits from the Vulgate by way of Erasmus the following words: "It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks." And he, trembling and astonished, said, "Lord, what wilt thou have me to do?" And the Lord said unto him. We should note that these words do legitimately belong to Paul's account of his conversion, as recorded by Luke in Acts 26, verses 14-15, and therefore no factual error has been introduced in this instance. But he tried to editorialize for whatever reason. And you would beg the question, what else did he do? See? But no version is perfect, no translation. That's why we compare. I compare 7. So Hodges, relative to the Westcott-Hort text. In 1881, Westcott and Hort published their 2-volume work, The New Testament in the Original Greek. To produce this text, they relied heavily on the witness of Codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, and they're excellent ones, but especially Vaticanus. Both of these documents come from the 4th century and were the oldest available manuscripts in their day. The critical texts in current use differ relatively little from the text published by Westcott Hort 100 years ago. F. Bruce. See, so we have a little margin, but let's be a student of the Word and read 5 or 6 or 7 versions. You have resources available, like the Complete Biblical Library in the Greek with parallel English and Greek words in English letters and so on. And the parts of speech. Just take a look. Here's my Word Search Bible, now owned by Logos. So you have dictionary references, and then you have parts of speech. Then you have the actual Greek in the manuscript that is most likely the most accurate one. Then you have it in English letters, so you don't have to start learning Greek letters. And then a good English translation. But then I look at the NASB. All things through him came into being, and without him. What does it say? All things came into being through him, and apart from him. And so we have some versions. They say the same words, same meaning through the different words. So these are good resources that we can study and be a good student of the Bible for this reason. So, the text of the Greek Testament established by B.F. Westcott and F.J.A. Hort and published with an explanatory introduction and appendices in 1881 introduced a fresh and more scientific method of classification according to textual types or families. This classification has the further advantage that it includes not only Greek manuscripts, but also the early versions in other languages and New Testament quotations in ancient authors. See, the early church fathers, they quoted it. And in the Greek. So we have all kinds of authentic comparative resources to look at. So Westcott and Hort were pioneers in this matter, and their classification has been corrected and expanded, but classification by types of text has been established as the most rational and fruitful classification of the evidence. It's organized. Get better organized when you do your stuff, homework and study. F. Bruce. The Westcott and Hort believed that the text which we have called the Alexandrian represented as nearly as could be attained the original autographic text. In their eyes, this text was marked by none of the deviations which they saw in other texts, and they expressed their high regard for it by naming it the neutral text. But further discovery and study have led to second thoughts on this matter. A number of scholars have adduced weighty arguments for preferring the claims of the Western text to be regarded as the representative of the first century text. I don't go that way. I just take case-for-case basis. Certainly